Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Song Jae-ryung from Kyunghee University. This year is the 40th anniversary of the UN International Day of Peace. Kyunghee University System has been holding Peace Bar Festival International Conference every year to celebrate the International Day of Peace and discuss ways to respond to the global challenges. In the early 20th century, the world is now facing the civilizational crisis. Kyunghee University System believes that the survival and existence is being threatened, and now we are going to bring about a dialogue series. No Time to Lose, a quest for immediate action for planetary crisis to shed light on transformation of our knowledge. We have 4 dialogues. On September 17th, we had the first dialogue, and on October 15th and 26th, we have the second and third dialogue in this series. Today, we are going to have the 4th dialogue, which is the culmination of the series of dialogues. For today's dialogue, we have invited Professor and the founder of Potsdam Institute, Professor Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber. He's joining us online, and we are going to talk about the age of climate change. How can we survive this crisis? No one is immune to the threat caused by climate change in our future. Everybody needs to stay alerted to this danger as long as we live on this earth. Today, we are overwhelmed by the warnings of the end of global civilization due to the ecological hazards of climate change. The speeches made by the world leaders at the 26th Conference of the Parties held in the UK clearly revealed this sense of crisis. For example, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned the heads of states that our fragile planet is still hanging on a single strand and is knocking on the door of climate catastrophe, pointing out the human civilization's obsession with fossil fuels, which is driving human civilization to the brink. He has said it is enough that we have cruelly treated biodiversity and is killing ourselves with carbon. It is enough that we use nature as our toilet. It is enough that we burn and mine and excavate the nature. We are digging our own graves. He said that now is the time to say no more. In response to the COP26 statements, Secretary General Guterres said we have taken an important step. However, he pointed out that gathering political will alone is not enough to resolve the climate challenge. We have to transition to emergency situation to continue to have even the slim chance of achieving carbon zero. This passionate warning from the UN Secretary General, as today's first interlocutor, Professor Schellnhuber, mentioned in 2017, if concrete action is not taken on climate change by 2020, the world will suffer catastrophic damage. And it clearly reflects his warning. In this regard, in this interview, I would like to discuss with Professor Schellnhuber about what are the critical points in the era of climate change and the Earth system. Can we Earthlings overcome the catastrophic scenario of global warming and the resulting climate system? How should the present human society urgently deal with the future Earth? Do we really have any hope left? I hope this conversation will help us find the answer. And the person who will be speaking with Professor Schellnhuber is Professor Cho Chun-ho of Kyunghee Cyber University. Professor Cho specializes in climate change topics. Let me introduce you to 2 professors briefly. First, Professor Schellnhuber, who has been working as an atmospheric scientist and climatologist, received his PhD in theoretical physics from Regents University of Germany in 1980. He received habilitation in physics. And since then, he served as a visiting professor at the Potsdam University, Oldenburg University, and Santa Fe Institute in the United States. Above all, Professor Schullenhuber established the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany in 1992 and served as its first director. As it is well known, the Potsdam Institute is the world's best research institute on climate change and has become an unrivaled research institute with an interdisciplinary approach to climate change with about 300 researchers now. As it is widely known, in the mid-1990s, Professor Schullenhuber proposed a 2-degree guardrail to the global warming problem, which was adopted by the German government and the European Union. He has made a significant contribution to its adoption as a target by countries around the world, according to the 2009 Copenhagen Accord. Professor Schullenhuber is an unrivaled expert in the theory of climatological tipping points in particular. He has been warning of the horrific consequences of global warming. Professor Schullenhuber has played a variety of roles and activities to share his findings and warnings about the climate change and crisis with social, economic, and political spheres of the global community beyond Europe. And accordingly, he has been awarded the German Environmental Prize in 2007, and in 2011, he became the first German to receive the Volvo Environmental Prize. He was awarded 27 Blue Planet Prize. His major books include Earth System Analysis and the Second Copernican Revolution, and he has published 250 research papers, including the trajectories of the Earth systems in the Anthropocene, and he published more than 50 books as well. Professor Cho Chun-ho, who will be leading the conversation, is an atmospheric scientist. He has received his PhD from Yonsei University and worked as a researcher at the National Institute of Meteorology. He researched in the fields of forecasting climate, Earth monitoring, Earth system. He has also served as a research fellow at the Carbon Cycle Group at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Earth Science Institute. He served as a director of the National Academy of Meteorological Science. From 2019, he has been teaching as a professor in climate change topics at Gyeonggi Cyber University School. He is active in civic groups such as Network of Scientists and Technicians Dreaming of Change and Climate Crisis Emergency Actions. And from 2017, he has been writing regularly for major daily newspapers in Korea. Climate change. And his books include Blue Sky, Red Earth, Climate Change, Anthropocene, and Integrated Discussion on Earth System. And he has published 8 books, including Science and Climate Change and Politics, and published dozens of studies and reports. Today's conversation will be centered around the free discussions between the two professors. Before the conversation, we'll listen to Professor Schullenhuber's lecture for 20 minutes, and immediately after the lecture, Professor Cho Chun-ho will lead the conversation. Now, let us listen to the lecture by Professor Hans-Joachim Schullenhuber. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to South Korea. Professor Lee, Professor Cho, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I will try to share my screen with you. Let me see. Yeah. So I hope you can see it. Is that right? Okay, so I will start with my lecture now and hope that the technology will work right. Can I get any feedback whether the screen is shared with you, whether you can see it? Thank you very much. And we have the interpretation. So I'll go ahead. So the title is The Climate Challenge and the Great Transformation. So on the one hand, as has been said already, we have a major challenge, and I tried to lay it out to demonstrate what is really at risk and what is at stake. And the second part will be, what do we need to do in order to still avert a major climate crisis? And I will also come up with a specific solution I've been thinking about for several years now. And I think there is something what you might even call a silver bullet solution. But let's see. So we just had, and this was discussed in the beginning, we just had the so-called COP26 in Glasgow, and a number of interesting decisions were made. You can see some of them dealing with methane, phasing out of coal globally, which is a major challenge, and so on. But we will discuss this later on. What steps have been made? Are they sufficient? And on what trajectory are we actually right now? And of course, a major reference to everything is the report. And you see a very prominent member from South Korea in the IPCC, the report on 1.5 degrees. Because in Paris, there was, as an international agreement, an international law, the decision to keep global warming well below 2 degrees, but there are ambitions as an aspirational goal, try to keep global warming, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is very, very hard to achieve. And actually, based on my expertise, we will not hold that line, but we actually can see it as a long-term reference point and maybe come back to even less than 1.5 degrees later. So I introduced actually as a member, together with colleagues, in the third assessment report of the IPCC, which was published in 2001, the so-called burning embers diagram. And that was the idea, if you look just to the right-hand panel, the idea was in the third assessment report, you see in the right panel, you see on the left column, third assessment report, TAR 2001. The idea was, at what global warming level do we have major nonlinear changes in the Earth system? We called them large-scale singular events, now better known as tipping points, or the activation of tipping elements. And you see we had, because you do not have precise analysis, or we don't have them yet, we said, let's use a color coding in the sense that if you are in the white region, there is no major risk. If you turn yellow, you see here in the third assessment report, it was between 3 degrees and 5 degrees when you are entering a very difficult zone. And if you are in the red zone, if the red color appears, then you can actually expect that a tipping event will happen. And now you see, and this is really remarkable, how the color has changed over the various assessments. So in the AR5, the fifth assessment report, you see that the red color has come down already. And in the 1.5 degrees report, which is now our reference point, 2018, you see that already below 1 degree, the yellow color appears. And if you are beyond 2 degrees, it's turning red already. Yeah? And now if you compare this with the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees, you see the broken line, and the full line, 2 degrees. You see, yes, we have to actually stop global warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Otherwise, we will run into uncharted territory and major risk of tipping events. Now, in a way, it's all based on this analysis. So I introduced this map of the tipping elements in the Earth system in a lecture I gave at Oxford University in the year 2001, actually. And you see there the vital organs of the planetary system, of the planetary body, if you like. So the big ice sheets, of course, the big ecosystems like the Amazon rainforest. But for in the short term, maybe even more important, the circulation patterns in the ocean, that is the so-called Atlantic thermohaline circulation or Gulf Stream. But in the atmosphere, it's the so-called jet stream, which is a band of high-speed wind going from the west to the east, about 10 to 12 kilometers above ground. And this is organizing on the northern hemisphere. Our weather system is also responsible for extreme events. You see here Greenland ice sheet. I mean, the amazing thing is that you had in the last years the loss of 1 million tons of ice per minute, actually. So the Greenland ice sheet, its stability is at stake, probably beyond 2 degrees. It will be completely destabilized and will collapse over hundreds and thousands of years, of course. I mentioned already the Gulf Stream. Colleagues of mine have shown that the current Gulf Stream is the weakest in the last millennium. And I mentioned already the jet stream. Now you see, these are real data provided by NASA. You see how this jet stream is moving, it's meandering, it's building, forming big bulges. And actually the animation will stop, and when you will see a big so-called Rossby wave. These are the variations of the jet stream over the North American continent or subcontinent. What you see here is that the jet stream is pushed very far to the north. So hot and dry air from Mexico is moving up to Alaska, actually. And this is, of course, an extreme weather event. Now, if this Rossby wave would move across the Atlantic, move away within a few days, it would be fine. But actually, we have now seen over the last decades that these Rossby waves become stationary for many weeks. So you see, for example, here in 2018, on the right-hand side, we had this problem that the Rossby wave stayed stationary over Central Europe, for example, for 6-8 weeks or longer. We had forest fires in Scandinavia. And on the other side of the Atlantic, you had a cold spell, a Rossby wave reaching far to the south on the east coast of the United States, bringing about flooding, chilly weather, and so on. And according to our analysis, we published a major paper on that in 2013. The jet stream will become more wiggly in the future, and the Rossby waves will become more stationary. That means we will have a new regime of extreme weather events. Amazon rainforest, because of human intervention, forest fires, and so on, we estimate, and global warming, changes in the precipitation patterns. We assume that the tipping point can happen at 2.5, 3 degrees warming, something like that, if there is more human intervention even earlier. So all together is assembled, everything is assembled in this chart. That is a paper we published in 2016 in Nature Climate Change. And this is a major chart, and I will dwell with it for a minute because it's very important. What you see here, the horizontal line is the time axis. So you can go back to the last ice age, the minimum of temperature, 20,000 years before present. And you see the wiggly line is the global mean temperature. So it was just about 3 degrees colder at a global scale at that time when in the Holocene 11,000 years ago, we emerged for the ice age. And when you see the climate was more or less stable over the last 2,000 years, and on the right-hand side, you see this colored fan. These are the scenarios. Where do we go, actually? If everything goes right, we stop That's the green line. We stop below 1.5 degrees. But there are intermediate scenarios. Unfortunately, currently, we are still more or less on the dark red line. That would mean we would have in the year 2500 something like 8 degrees warming. And the Paris range is this horizontal gray bar. You can see the Paris corridor. And now the really important message is, when will the various tipping elements be activated? And you see we have again this color coding, yellow, red, and so on. And you have a number of tipping elements which could be activated already in the Paris corridor. So for example, you see in the left-hand bar, in the left-hand box, you see the coral reefs will probably die back already between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming. The Western Antarctic ice sheet, some parts have been activated already. You see Greenland and so on. So the Paris corridor is actually something like a firewall. It can exclude some major events. You see on the right-hand side, the collapse of the Fermi-Line circulation, the collapse of the Amazon rainforest, and most importantly, the collapse of the Eastern Arctic ice sheet. If that becomes destabilized, we will have global warming that would be the range 6-7 degrees, and in particular, we would have sea level rise of another 50 meters. So the message is the following: if we hold the Paris lines, if we keep global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees, some tipping events will already happen, but the worst of them will be avoided. So the Paris Agreement is a firewall against disastrous global warming. Now that's the story, and just go on here. The paper, which has become quite famous now on trajectories of the Earth system in the Anthropocene, which were published in 2018 in Proceeding of the National Academy of the United States, that tells us that actually something could go wrong in a very intricate way, because the various tipping processes could conspire and could bring about something like a major destabilization of the global environment beyond 2 degrees. And I give you just one example how this interaction of tipping elements could happen. We have now the Arctic warming 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. This has a major implication for the surface melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Now, if more fresh water goes into the North Atlantic, this in a way is destabilizing the Fermi-Line circulation in the North Atlantic, but also the jet stream. The jet stream, again, as I explained, has a major impact on extreme events, for example, heat waves in Siberia. That could affect the permafrost, could accelerate permafrost melting. This in turn will create forest fires, and the Arctic warming would be accelerated in turn. So it's a vicious circle that could be created. Now, we will discuss it later. The science is in no way settled about this. Many things are speculations. We have indication from historical data, but it is a risk we have to explore in the future. So let me share this with you, which is a very important finding also. Where does the extra heat go? And actually, most of it goes into the ocean, more than 90%, just 2 or 3% into the atmosphere. And that is a major challenge, because the oceans accumulate the heat for millennia, actually. So even if we stop CO2 emissions and methane emissions, and the atmosphere becomes more balanced, there is still this accumulated heat over the last 2 centuries, and the oceans will actually exhale this heat over millennia. So global warming will only stop if the ocean come into equilibrium again. So we have a legacy of the Industrial Revolution that will linger with us for many millennia. So we have to stop emissions immediately. Is this how our civilization ends? Hopefully not. What can we do about it? And I'll give you just a few hints. We have published a paper in Science in 2017, a roadmap for rapid decarbonization. The idea is to bring down emissions to half them actually every decade now, and to virtually become decarbonized by 2050 globally. That means the industrialized countries actually have to decarbonize by 2040 or 2045 at the latest. Now, this will happen through the switch to renewable energies. On the left-hand side, you see what type of renewable energy will win in the end in the various countries. Wherever you see the yellow color, it will be photovoltaics. That includes South Korea, for example, and of course, most of the global South. There are just a few countries where wind energy will be the dominant source. And in green, you see countries like Germany, where you have a mix of wind energy, solar energy, hydroelectricity, and so on. My final argument, where I will spend a few minutes, is decarbonization is important. We have to get rid of fossil fuels in our global economy. But at the same time, we will only be successful with the Paris Agreement if we protect the existing biospheric carbon sinks, that is in particular the forests of the world, and we have to create additional artificial carbon sinks. And how this can be done, I will show you now. I can refer again to the IPCC report, where on 1.5 degrees, there has been a lot of arguments about negative emissions, so creating additional carbon sinks, where we remove by management actually carbon from the atmosphere. And the main hope was that it will be provided by BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I'm very skeptical about it. What would in particular mean you take biomass, you convert it into biofuels, you sequester the carbon by sort of filtering out the CO2 from the smoke and so on. I'm skeptical about it. I think there's a better way to do it. And first of all, of course, we have to protect the world's forests. We have to stop deforestation in the global south, of course. We have to plant new trees, and actually there is this paper by Bastard et al., who showed that on degraded land you could actually reforest about 900 million hectares, which would provide a major carbon sink. And it's the precondition for using timber and bamboo for our built environment. So I go through that quickly. The elephant in the climate room, and that is my main argument when it comes to carbon sinks, is the built environment, the elephant in the climate room. It's responsible for about 40% of the global emissions by constructing buildings, by maintaining and operating buildings, and by destroying them again. The built environment is responsible for more than 55% of the waste, and it requires about 70 to 80% of the resources as well. So if we transform the built environment in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, then we will also win the war against global warming. We have published a paper on that, and the basic idea is if a tree grows, it absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, if you take the wood from the tree, convert it into timber, and use it for constructing buildings, and these buildings will last for several centuries when you have created a carbon sink. And the major idea is buildings as a global carbon sink, that you convert our cities where you have now been constructed from steel and concrete into, urban forests, if you like, if we really convert them into organic material-based construction when you have created an artificial carbon sink. And of course, that applies in particular for the cities that still have to be built. And I show you just as a demonstration, we have calculated if for additional 2 billion people who will populate this planet by the year 2050, if you build most buildings, 90% from concrete and steel, on the right-hand side, you see a gigantic extra emission of carbon, more than 70 billion tons of CO2. But if you do it from wood, from timber, from bamboo, and so on the one hand, you avoid almost all of these emissions on the right-hand side. You see the emission bar is shrinking heavily, but in addition, you store 75 billion tons of CO2. So altogether, this is already 30 to 40% of the remaining carbon budget we have for the 1.5 degrees. And this can be done through what I call a forestry construction pump. So you plant trees, you cut them, use them for timber production, you immediately replant the trees. That is the forestry pump. And the same with the built environment. You build from timber, but once you don't use the building anymore, you dismantle it and build from the timber new constructions. And this all together helps to clean the atmosphere from CO2. This is in the tradition. So I helped to create a new Bauhaus movement. That's the old Bauhaus that was actually pioneering construction in the 20th century. The Bauhaus was created by Walter Gropius and others in 1919 in Germany, in Weimar, and then more or less set the stage for construction in the 20th century. The remarkable thing was that it was an integrated approach. I wanted to bring together architects, designers, artists, carpenters, technologists, and so on, entrepreneurs together to build a new environment actually for the masses and not for the elites anymore. So it was also a project of social progress. And now I've helped to create now a new movement. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Union, has last year in a State of the European Union speech announced a new European Bauhaus, which will focus on three things. It will focus on sustainability, so it will explore the use of biomaterials in future construction. It will be inclusive, so how can we provide decent accommodation for every person on this planet? And it's also about beauty. It's about aesthetic values. How can we build our cities in a much more beautiful and more humane way in the future? Because after the Second World War, and it happens in Germany, in Belgium, in Korea, in Japan, in the United States, everywhere, we have built mainly ugly, dysfunctional buildings, skyscrapers, which are not at the human dimension, if you like, and this has to be changed. So the idea is to, in one way, to protect the climate by building a better environment and providing better accommodation for humanity. In my view, this is really a silver bullet. So I leave this solution with you. And in Germany, I have created as a charity or not-for-profit organization, the Bauhaus der Erde, Bauhaus Earth, And that has taken off now, and it is actually something that will have a major impact on the new German government. They just announced that a ministry for construction and accommodation will be created now, and it hopefully will be very much inspired by the Paris Agreement and by the quest for climate solution. So with this I end, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Professor Schellnhuber, we had really enjoyed your presentation. It was impressive. The title of today's meeting is Age of Climate Change, How Can We Survive the Crisis? And his presentation was about how we can overcome the crisis. And the climate challenge and the great transformation, greenhouse gas emitted by mankind, is not only a factor that determines the Earth's temperature. The Earth can amplify itself through positive feedback. Tipping point is an irreversible risk and existential threat to civilization. And also, once again, it gives a huge threat. And in order to resolve these issues, energy systems and also the space, we need to implement transformation right away. That's the only way we can resolve the crisis. Thank you so much for your presentation. In order to resolve the climate crisis, not only the natural science, but social science, and once again, we need to come up with a full interdisciplinary analysis so that we can come up with the solutions to change the climate crisis. So the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research was established and founded by Professor Schellnhuber, and you serve as the leader and the chairman of this research institute. So here comes my first question. What is the purpose and the most essential activity of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research? And also, why did you establish that, and what was the most recent activity?
That's very interesting, actually. My good friend Klaus Hasselmann, who received the Physics Nobel Prize just a few weeks ago, together with Manabe from Japan, you know, they were leaders and pioneers in climate modeling. He was actually the head of the founding committee for the Potsdam Institute. So I met them in 1991. It was just after Germany became reunited, which is something, in a way, a role model for Korea, I hope, in a way. And so the idea was, climate modeling was established at the time, but nobody had ever thought about the impacts of global warming. What will it mean if the Earth really warms by 2, 3, or 4 degrees? And what can be done about it, actually? What are the solutions? How can we avoid it? And nowhere in the world was any institute looking into that. Why? Because at that time it was still hotly debated whether global warming is real at all. Although already in 1896, Svante Arrhenius, the famous Swedish scientist, had already calculated the greenhouse effect. That is the famous paper dating back more than a century. But anyway, Klaus Hasselmann and a few other prominent scientists from Germany said, we need to establish an institute that really looks into the consequences of warming. And of course, the idea was that if we see that the risks are too high, to foster all types of measures in order to avoid global warming. So I was asked, I was at that time a young physicist working at the University of Oldenburg, that just received a chair, a professorship, full professorship. And I was asked to think about a concept for that. And I said, the only way you can address this is in an interdisciplinary way. You have to think of how will the extreme events pattern change? What will it mean for agriculture? If agriculture is suffering from global warming, what will be the best measures against it? But if you do it just in a brute force way, you may have even more emissions from methane, for example, and so on. What will you do about extreme events in the hydrological system, for example? Is it enough to just build dikes? What will you do for coastal protection and so on? And the question is, will the measures in a way accelerate global warming, or can you find ways to adapt to global warming that will at the same time mitigate global warming? So in the end, it's a very complicated systems analysis you have to do. And on that way, I in particular discovered that you have to look at the non-linearities. So are there critical thresholds in the climate system which you must not transgress? And this in the end, I pursued that for many years. This in the end is the ultimate justification for a global temperature limit, which in the end materialized in the Paris Agreement. So it's been a long, long journey, but it was a journey of systems analysis. It was a journey of integrated, interdisciplinary analysis in the end of the entire Earth system. So we have come a very, very long way.
Thank you, Professor Schullenhuber. This interdisciplinary research center is a very encouraging thing. And I have a question about you as a person. Professor Schullenhuber, you are a theoretical physicist, and how did you get interested in the tipping points related to climate change?
Yep, precisely through my work in complex systems, nonlinear dynamics. You know, I started as a fundamental scientist. I worked on quantum mechanics in particular. And when in the late 1970s, a new field of physics emerged, which was, by the way, also honored by the Physics Nobel Prize this year. And it was called chaos science at that time. Now, it has a more respectable name now. We talk about the theory of complex systems, nonlinear dynamics. So when I went to the United States, I worked at the University of California. This was a field just emerging, and it was about, in particular, nonlinear effects. So when I came back to Germany and ultimately founded the Potsdam Institute, I thought, well, most of the analysis done so far, in particular by the economists, were more or less just linear analysis. In a way, you just draw straight lines, and when you ask when will the costs of an effect be bigger than the cost of avoiding the effect. So that is the conventional linear paradigm of economic analysis. And I thought, well, the world is full of non-linearities, actually. Water is freezing at 0 degrees, but it's a phase transition, or systems become destabilized if you tip them at a certain point, for example. So I thought this entire field of complexity and nonlinearity has to be considered when we deal with global warming. Why? Because if you look back in climate history, it's full of nonlinear events. For example, the Fermaline circulation, the Gulf Stream collapsed many times in the Earth system, and the so-called Heinrich events. So it's very important, actually, it's very important that you look at these nonlinearities. So I used my full knowledge and my full analysis of complex systems and applied it to the Earth system, to global warming, which was more or less for the first time, really. And when you immediately go into this field and find there are, if you like, vital organs in the Earth system, what will happen to the Greenland ice sheet, for example. And here I just give you a nonlinear effect. You know, the Greenland ice sheet is about 2,000 to 3,000 meters high. Now, if surface warming happens, when the surface is moving to a lower level, of course, where it is already much warmer. And so it's an accelerating process. The deeper you go, the faster the acceleration. The deeper you go, the faster the melting happens. And you cannot stop it anymore once it is created. And so the climate system is full of nonlinear effects. And that I introduced in particular in the debate for the third assessment report when I was a coordinating lead author for Working Group 2. And this has become ever more prominent the more people have worked about it. And now we see, I showed you one of his charts, that actually the ultimate justification for the Paris Agreement is we need to avoid critical thresholds. We must avoid that some of the vital organs of the planetary system are tipped into a new state or even tipped into annihilation.
Well, upon listening your answer, you talk about the non-linear cost effectiveness. We shouldn't do that, but rather we should come up with a response toward the non-linear events. But 2018, the professor of Yale University who received Economic Nobel Laureate Award, he said that if the Earth's temperature increases like 3 to 4 degrees, and that is the most optimum for economic cost and benefits. But science tells us that global warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees is the critical level. Then how should we interpret the differences? So can you tell us?
Okay, so you're talking about Bill Nordhaus?
네, 지금 노드하우스 경제 그 학자를 말씀하시는 거죠? Yes, correct. Economist Nordhaus.
Yeah. Nordhaus, who received the Nobel Prize in Economics. Now you know that the other contender for the Nobel Prize in Economics was Mr. Weizmann, and who had this theory about the fat tails of the effects, the economic effects. I had many discussions with Bill Nordhaus about this, and I think in his entire theory, he does not really appreciate and he does not really include the nonlinear dynamics. There is no economic model in the world, integrated assessment, which is fully incorporating the nonlinear dynamics. So in a linear world, if the climate damages just proportionally increase with global warming, the Nordhaus analysis is correct. But if you include the nonlinearities, you see that you have to come down with the optimal temperature. And actually, colleagues of mine of the Potsdam Institute have done such an analysis, and they find that you definitely have to be below 2 degrees. They even said, if you consider the cost of mitigation as well as the damages avoided, 2 degrees is the optimum point. And I'm sure economic thinking will progress and it will advance. And in the end, it will find, yes, 3 to 4 degrees is just too high. It is actually destabilizing our civilization.
Thank you. Now, in our science, when we talk about tipping point, what we say it's 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. It's not just one single number. It's two numbers, not one number. 1.5 and 2 degrees. So are they uncertain? So what does 1.5 and 2 degrees mean? Do they stand for the uncertainties in science?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. We have many uncertainties here. First of all, the first question is there something like a global tipping point? And this was discussed in this paper about the trajectories of the Earth system in the Anthropocene. So is there a point, say 3 degrees warming, where the cascade of tipping events in a way is setting into motion a sliding down a slippery slope of the Earth system and could bring us into a sort of hothouse Earth with 6, 7, or 8 degrees warming. I personally think the risk of that is very low. It's maybe 2 or 3%. On the other hand, would be the end of our world. So 2 to 3% is still very high. Huh? If you would enter an airplane and the pilot would tell you, you will have a crash with 2 or 3% probability, I don't think you would enter the airplane. Huh? So we talk about the fate of humanity. No, but actually there are many tipping points in the system. Huh? So the West Antarctic ice sheet will melt much earlier than the East Antarctic ice sheet, for example. So you have a series of tipping events, so to speak. Some of them will happen simultaneously, but some of them will happen very early. For example, the loss of tropical reefs will happen already at 1.5 degrees, while the last in line will be the East Antarctic ice sheet. If that starts to melt, I mean, sea level will rise by 50, 60, 70 meters. That would be the end of all our coastal zones, so to speak. So you're right. There are two things. One of them is, even if we would know the precise tipping point temperature, they are at different temperatures. And this other thing is the uncertainty, because the research on tipping points has started much too late, in my view. We should have done this already 20 years ago. And, you know, still people debate, is there such a thing as a tipping point for the Greenland ice sheet? If you look back in climate history, yes, it happened many times. I'm absolutely convinced. But we have actually dragged our feet for too long. We have not started with this research. And that's why the economists cannot incorporate it in their models, of course. The physical basis for that has been neglected for a long, long time, actually.
네.
Next, Professor, in 2001, you joined the IPCC assessment report and you have addressed tipping point. Now, if you look at IPCC assessment report, all the scientists gather together, they reach an agreement, and then they publish report. Of course, there are a lot of benefits, such as they carefully and consider various things. However, it seems like that it's very conservative. Then, what is the probability of global warming surpassing the current IPCC projections? Because there are possibility that we might be missing something. And if so, which tipping point is most likely to do that?
Yeah. Now, first of all, the IPCC is not doing research. They just can provide the assessment on the basis of published peer-reviewed articles, of course. And as I said, since the field of tipping points has been neglected for a long time, also because we didn't have the data, we didn't have the models, complexity science had to advance and had to progress first. We have not so much literature on that as we have on very simple effects like how global warming or local warming will affect the harvesting of certain grains, for example. We have a much wider literature on that. So inherently, by construction, if you like, the IPCC reports are conservative. And they are, in my view, lagging behind the front line of research by at least 10 years or something. That is the problem. And this is a problem because it might mean that we are approaching red lines very rapidly, actually, before without having early warning signals. And this is a problem. The question is whether you want to adopt as a politician the precautionary principle, or you just want to do optimal management. Optimal management would mean the economists do precisely that. You calculate the cost of mitigation, the cost of adaptation, and so on, the damage costs, of course, and then you try to find an optimal strategy. But if you do the precautionary principle, when you try to protect humanity even against 2% probability events, because they could be the end of our civilization, but then the costs would be, of course, much higher, and it can turn out that you protected humanity against something that never happened. Somebody needs to take the responsibility for that. I would rather be on the precautionary side, but governments tend to do optimal cost analysis. That is a problem.
Thank you, Professor. And now, regarding the danger of tipping point, we are emphasizing the risk all the time. And in 2020, last year, we have already gone up 1.5% global average compared to the pre-industrial level, 1.5 degrees. If it were the tipping point, then we are at the tipping point. And under such circumstances, can we continue to promote 1.5 as something that we can control?
Now, that's a very important and a very deep question. Actually, I was member of the German delegation in Paris in 2015, when, as was said rightly, the 2009 Copenhagen Accord was implemented in a way to have international law to keep global warming below 2 degrees. But at that time, in particular, the small island states in Paris came up with a more ambitious level of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. Now, in terms of climate impacts to be avoided, I mentioned the coral reefs, but also in terms of sea level rise, 1.5 would be, of course, much better for our civilization than 2 degrees. Unfortunately, I see a very, very slim chance to keep global warming between 1.5 degrees. If you just look at the latest IPCC report, I showed the various scenarios. If you look at the aerosol hiding effect, we have still so much ordinary air pollution that it is masking the CO2. I think if we would get rid of the air pollution, the aerosols, that would mean already another half degree of warming, for example. So there are many reasons why we cannot hold the 1.5 degrees line. So I think we need a more holistic approach to it. I think we should do everything, according to my own analysis, to keep global warming below or near 2 degrees. I think beyond 2 degrees, many things will happen which we cannot undo later, so irreversible things. But 1.5 degrees, I think we will overshoot also permanently in 20, 30 years from now. But I showed you a possibility to come back to 1.5 degrees if we would create global carbon sinks, and the construction sector would actually provide an opportunity for that. So my scenario for the future is humanity should do everything to keep global warming near 2 degrees, and then start now already measures to restore the global climate to 1.5 or even less in the decades to come. But this is a very, very long shot. I guess that only in the next century we will restore the climate to 1.5 or even 1 degree, because actually like Jim Henson also said famously, I think 1 degree warming would probably a level which is most benign for global civilization.
1.5 degrees. Now, tipping point. Yes, we are in a desperate situation. Thank you for mentioning that. Doctor, well, you always talk about non-linearity. You mentioned that you can only beat non-linearity with non-linearity. You said that. In other words, in order to prevent the climate tipping point, social tipping point is required. Now, looking at climate crisis, its connection with the social tipping point, how should we understand that? How should we understand the connectivity of that?
Now, thank you very much for mentioning this, because if you look at the complexity and nonlinearity of the climate system, you should also look at the complexity and nonlinearity of the social system, which in the end has to manage global warming. So we published a paper last year also in PNAS, Proceeding of the National Academy, on social tipping points, which has become very prominent and has been referred to many times already, where we came up with 5, 6, 7 ways how nonlinearity could help us in accelerating, protecting the climate, and even restoring the climate. And one example is very popular now, the youth movement, which Greta Thunberg started, Fridays for Future, which is, at least in Europe, very prominent, not so much in the United States, probably not so much in South Korea and Japan, but in Europe it's very prominent. And it has helped, for example, to change the mood and to change the mind of most European governments. So we have in Europe now the Green Deal, European Green Deal, which was announced by Ursula von der Leyen. I mentioned her last year, which means Europe wants to become the first climate neutral continent on Earth. And that was very much inspired by the youth movement, for example. Other things are the rapid acceleration of renewable energy. And I think another tipping point, a social tipping point, could be that we consider to build all our cities in the future, all our infrastructures, from bio-based materials. As I mentioned, you now can, using cross-laminated timber, you can build skyscrapers from timber, actually. And some of them are being built already in Vienna, in Norway, in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania. In Japan, they plan to have a 100-story timber skyscraper, for example. Now, once people see that this is feasible, it's even more comfortable and it's nicer when building skyscrapers from concrete and steel. I think it will start a social movement, really. So it will tip the construction market actually towards bio-based material. So in the end, it's the power of ideas. It's the power of inspiration. The biggest non-linearity in the world is our fantasy and our imagination. And we have to harness it for building a better world.
Now, Professor Schullenhuber, you're not just a scientist, but you have also advised German Chancellor and EU President. You have served as their advisor for climate change. And in that regard, I have a question. In Western European countries, most of the countries, regardless of their political party, whether they are conservatism or progressive, they all take climate crisis as their key national agenda. How were you able to do that? Because in the United States, depending on which political party you support, you have two extreme different positions about climate change. But the Western European country seems to have a consensus about that. How were you able to create the mood?
Okay, it was not me alone, of course. I had some influence and I had some chances actually to talk to political leaders. Yes, that's true. I think in Europe, the secret is that scientific evidence and academic research is held in very high regard still. You know, the Enlightenment started in Europe, of course, in the 17th century, based on, you know, great minds, Newton and Leibniz and Immanuel Kant and Descartes and so on. When you had after the French Revolution, you had this idea that even society is ruled by scientific evidence. And this went up and down, but in the end, you have this legacy of Enlightenment, scientific evidence in Europe. And in the various cultures of Europe, whether you go to Italy, to Russia, to Sweden, to Germany, to France, anywhere, you have this legacy of the Enlightenment. So when you want to deal with climate change, you must not listen to conspiracy theories or things like that, as many people do, unfortunately, in the United States. You have to ask the famous academies, the Royal Society, the German Leopoldina, and so on, the Academy of Athens. You have to ask them, what shall we do? And I found that as a professor of climate science, people are willing to listen to you, actually. And I hope the same situation is true in South Korea. I also found it happening in Japan, for example, when the Japanese government, after the terrible accident of Fukushima, when they developed a new energy strategy, I was invited to give a lecture in the parliament in Tokyo, and people listened to me, and I gave advice to the committee. So in the end, the idea is, or the finding is, that we can only build a better world, a stable world, a resilient world where the economy can thrive also in the centuries before us, if we base our decisions on scientific evidence and technological innovation. And this is also seen by many people in the United States. But in the United States, half of the population is not believing in science. And so you have this polarization, you have this bipolarity in the community, that if the Democrats say, listen to the science, the Republicans say the science is useless. And this is a cultural thing, actually. And the good thing is that in Europe, this division never really happened.
Well, we heard what is happening in Europe now. I'd like to hear about what is happening in Germany. During your presentation, one of your slides showed that in case of Germany, Germany has a plan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, and the levelized cost of electricity is the highest in Europe. For the renewable electricity is really, really high. And it's so high, but how come Germany is planning to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045? Does renewable energy offer bigger economic benefits compared to the coal or nuclear power? How did German citizens develop such an awareness? How can this be possible, and how can this be realized? And how did you manage to realize the German citizenship? So these are my questions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is a set of questions, and it would take a long time to answer them all, actually. You are right. The energy cost, or the cost of electricity, are, I think, the second highest in Europe, or at a very high level. In Italy, they are also very expensive, or in Denmark and so on. But this has a number of reasons. It's not anymore that wind energy or photovoltaics are so expensive when it comes to the generation of electricity. The costs have fallen down below the cost you need to produce power from coal, lignite, and so on. The costs are so high because, for example, we still have the feed-in tariff system, which actually created the renewable energy revolution in the world. You know, the German government, a long time ago, introduced the feed-in tariff system, rewarding everybody who is using green electricity, rewarding for 20 years or something. This was taken up when by other countries, in particular China, and started with revolution of photovoltaics and wind energy. Now the German feed-in tariff system is still creating big costs, actually. This will be reformed in the next years, for example, when we have the cost of the distribution of the electricity. So the grid, the national grid, where we have to come down with the cost. But all in all, people are convinced that in the long term, renewable energy will be the cheapest. And actually, if you use it at the local scale, and I'm sure it will happen in 20 years from now, if you build a house somewhere in the countryside or in suburbia or even in the city, energy will come from the sun, from the wind, from geothermal and so on. And you will probably be completely autonomous in your energy supply. And the cost will only be the cost of the initial investment. And so in the end, after we have gone over this cost hill, so to speak, we will actually provide energy for almost nothing. That's the future. But it's always like that. If you are a pioneer in a new technology or in a new market, you have to pay extra costs in the beginning. It will only pay off. That is true for every investment. In the beginning, you have to make this investment. It will cost a lot of money. But in the long term, you will be fine. And actually, you will be the champion in the market. And that is the plan. And hopefully, it will work out.
네.
I think we need to begin wrapping up. And climate change. We have so many scientific evidence supporting climate change. But reducing carbon emission is very slow, actually. It is moving painfully slow. And policymakers and citizens, in order to make them realize the severity or urgency of this situation, what do you think we need to do most?
Yeah, it is actually what every politician tells me is that before you can come up with concrete measures, like now in Germany, the new government will want to boost renewable energy by 2030, 80% of the supply. The first stage always is to change the perception and the attitude of the public, really. Politicians will only implement the measure in a democratic society, of course. I'm not talking about authoritarian systems, but in a democracy, we first have to change the public awareness, the public perception, the public willingness for transformation. And that has happened now, in particular in Western Europe now. And Chancellor Merkel told me, first you have to change the discourse, the public discourse, and then politicians will take it up. And, you know, a major ally in our fight against global warming turned out to be the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, for example. I'm a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences as well. And the encyclical Laudato Si was published by the Vatican in 2015. I had the honor to sort of announce it and actually to present it to the world in Rome in June 2015, so before the Paris conference, together with Cardinal Turkson. And that was a new narrative, really. It was the narrative about the preservation of creation. And actually, it was supported also by people from the Orthodox Church, by Muslims, by Jewish people, by Buddhists, and so on. And I think if we come up with a new philosophy of what a good life is and what the respect for other living beings and other living creatures requires from us, when you can also change the policy, it never works the other way around. You cannot command actually a new thinking from the parliament or from the ministry. But if we have this change of discourse in society, and you, with your lecture series, contribute to this discourse, of course. So I'm very glad to be part of your series. If we change the attitude of the public, then we can also change the policy.
네, 그다음에
Doctor, at the end of your presentation, you talked about the fact that you are participating in an interesting project called New European Bauhaus by the European Commission. And between 1919, when Nazi closes the school for about 14 years, the school was open, but now one of the greatest influences given by the Bauhaus. And 2 years ago, there was an exhibition held in Seoul. So Bauhaus is very influential. And it's a school widely known. And now, with the name of the Bauhaus, you are trying to do a lot of planting and using trees. You are trying to rebuild and recover the cities. So when we talk about restoring or rebuilding urban cities, it means that city has a huge population density, and we are trying to enhance the efficiency of our livelihood. So when there are a lot of buildings, we need to make it a skyscraper. But how can you use trees to make it a skyscraper? Is it possible? Can you do that using a log, wood?
Now I'm glad you're asking me this, because we still think modern building is steel and concrete and glass and chemicals and so on, aluminium, etc. Now, the interesting thing is that now we know that we can build 100-story buildings, we can build train stations, we can build bridges, we can build almost everything from organic materials, in particular timber and bamboo. And this was a revolution in the construction sector that happened over the last 30 years or something. And of course, when you talk about building, energy efficiency is very important, but we do not lose the heat, for example, and we are very efficient in our technology, which we use for heating water and so on, things like that. But even more important is that we do not create so many emissions from the construction material itself. With concrete and steel, you have heavy CO2 emissions, whatever you do about it. If you use timber, if you use wood, it's quite the opposite. Actually, if you store the timber for a long time in a building for hundreds of years, you have actually extracted carbon from the atmosphere. And again, to your question, yes, I've talked to many building companies now, and they can build you any shape, any house, any construction, any infrastructure from organic material now. An interesting example is a company from Austria, Wiesner AG. They're just building in Singapore the library for the university. It's a huge timber construction. very beautiful, and it will actually store carbon instead of emit carbon. So I think that's where the future is. We still think the future is big skyscrapers from steel and concrete and everything rectangular. I think organic architecture, that's the new frontier of construction.
네. 당신이 우리 실렌 박사님 이야기를 들으면서
Professor Schullenhuber, listening to you, I believe that humans should try to perceive the problem, and in the process of resolving that problem, we become very imaginative and we can be really innovative. And this is the last question for this day. Professor Schullenhuber, you're studying tipping point. It's a matter of such desperation for the humanity. In that regard, where do you think we can find hope for the future of humanity?
Yeah, very good question. It has to do precisely what you said. It has to do with fantasy, imagination, and it has to do with unconventional allies. So when we would have had this discussion 10 years ago, you had no Fridays for Future, no youth movement. You had no encyclical by Pope Francis. So in the complex nonlinear system of society, all of a sudden, new allies emerge, actually. And this will also happen in the future. But the biggest source of hope is, as I said, our imagination. But 10 years ago, I also would not have thought that the construction sector, which is in a way the biggest problem in global warming, can be something like the savior, because it can, in the end, if done well, it can actually absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And so we keep on imagining, on visioning, on thinking, and so on. And I'm sure other very important solutions will emerge. If we stop thinking, if we confine our imagination to just a cost-benefit analysis in economic terms, instead of thinking of innovation, then of course we will fail, actually. But our fantasy is saving us, I'm sure. And actually, I can conclude with referring to Albert Einstein, the famous German physicist, actually was using one of his offices in Potsdam for a long time. And he said, the biggest resource of humanity is fantasy. So let's use this resource.
네. 오늘
Thank you very much, Professor Schullenhuber. Through this dialogue with you, we have gained a lot of insight and expanded the scope of our understanding.
그런데 우리 과학이라고 하는 거는
And science, as certain as we are, it could be as uncertain as it is certain. And in the process of resolving existing problems, we might be creating new challenges. But based on the understanding that we have gained from today's dialogue, I'm sure we will be able to create new problems, but in the process of resolving the problem, we'll be able to have a more tailored and sophisticated understanding of climate challenge. And thank you very much for sharing your precious time with us and giving us this precious insight. And thank you for joining us for a long time this morning in your time and through online. Many people have joined us today. I would like to thank everybody who has joined us today. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure to give this lecture, and it was a real pleasure to have this dialogue with you. So I hope to see you in life, in presence, physically in South Korea or Europe before long, after we have overcome this corona crisis. So I'm looking forward to meeting you in person. Thank you very much. And I thank everybody who was listening to my lecture. Thank you.
I really wish to meet you in person too.